Hello, hello, hello.
Hey, Jonathan, how are you this evening?
I'm good. How
Besides
about you?
cold and
I know. I mean, I had here a little bit of tea, and
ah,
I put really warm water, and it's cold already.
that's what I was gonna
I've been
say.
here
I
like
have
for 10 minutes.
warm water.
Oops, oops. But anyway, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Askable Adults Live, the show where we talk all things sex ed, community, and today, faith and values. But before we go all to that topic today and welcome our guest, we want to do our usual acknowledgement and recognitions, and that is that Black Lives Matter today and always. And I believe Nadine has a special shout out.
I do have a special shout out. I had the opportunity a few months back to see a webinar that was taught by Brittany Broda Smith, and we want to give a shout out to her. She is a licensed social worker, also has a master's degree in education, and she is the founder and CEO of the Intimacy Firm. She is a Christian sexologist who specializes in customizing daring discussions on the intersecting subjects of sexuality and faith to help folks reconcile the two. She has designed very unique ways to show people the love of God through sex ed and intimacy coaching. So she is delightful. You folks can Google her if they like. And I think her website is theintimacyfirm.com, I think. Um, and she is really known. She's very straight shooting. She's also very creative and clever. She has a great sense of humor. And she fuses all of that together with a really fresh take on faith-based sexuality education. So check her out, folks. It's good.
And that is amazing because that's actually one of the that topic that we are going to be discussing today. So shout out to Brittany Brodus Smith. And that might take we can use that as a segue to a show. But before that, who are you?
My name is Nadine, and I am the community liaison with Berks Teens Matter. My pronouns are they and their. And who are you, sir?
Who am I? I'm Jonathan Rodriguez. I'm the Youth and Health Resource Center Coordinator for Bergstein's Matters, and I use he, him, and elle pronouns. And today,
We have a very special guest.
do
Go
you want
ahead,
to?
Jonathan.
Do
No,
you
you
want?
introduce. You
Okay, okay, okay,
introduce.
okay, okay. So today we are talking with an amazing woman, mother, educator, a passionate advocate for comprehensive sex education, and who's also the pastor of One United Church of Christ in Kenhorst, Reverend Rebecca Hoover. Whee!
Hey, hey, hey.
Hi, how are you all?
Welcome.
I'm good. How
I'm
about you?
good.
It's great to be with you tonight.
It's
Re-
wonderful to have you with us tonight. Yeah.
Rebecca has also been part of BTM's leadership committee for
A
how
few
many
years?
years?
It's been a few. Yeah, it seems. I
Yeah,
think it has to have been at least 3 years. I think it might be more than that.
I
Like,
think it's somewhere around there.
yeah, it's been a while, and it's been a pleasure to have your engagement.
Likewise, it's been such good work, and I'm excited about being part of Berks Teens Matter and talking about sex education and comprehensive sex education.
Thank you so
Excellent.
much. We of course we had a lot to say in the introduction, but if we ask you to describe yourself in 3 words, what would you say? And I know it's like a very limited, but
It is. It's like a trinity of words. What do I pick? So I like alliteration. So we'll do creative, compassionate, and because I'm also student teaching and pastoring at the same time, I'm going to say caffeinated. If I didn't have
I love
coffee,
it.
I would not be moving right now. So
same.
caffeinated.
I love it. Yes, that's got to be quite a mix. Student teaching kindergartners
Yup.
and also pastoring at the same time, as well as your family responsibilities and everything else.
There's never a dull moment. There is always something to do, and it keeps me off the streets and out of trouble. So I love it. I love it all.
That's great. I'm
That's
glad
awesome.
that you are loving it and so actively engaged in life in our community.
We have a really good community, a lot of really good people, and it's been fun to see how it all comes together in church and in school in different ways, and it's different populations of the community. So I had one view as a pastor, and I'm getting a completely different view from student teaching, and I love how the two intersect and are so different at the same time.
And I'm imagining then that each one enriches the other.
Absolutely.
It's beautiful.
That's awesome.
Rebecca, I think I first met you because you were good enough to fill out a survey that I put out to some clergy people. And you were one of a small number in that survey who said, "Hey, I want to get involved. I want to be engaged with this stuff that Berks Teens Matter is doing." And so from the get-go, it was clear to me that you had passion for the mission of the work of Berks Teens Matter. And I wouldn't say that you're the only clergy person in the whole entire world who carries that passion for sexual health, comprehensive sex ed. But I will say that you're probably the only one that I really have come to know through engagement with Berks Teens Matter personally. And I'm curious to have you share with those who are joining us this evening. Where does that passion stem from, do you think?
That is such a good question, Nadine. So when I first started in ministry, back when I was in seminary, I worked as a director of Christian education and youth. And then my first church, I was an associate pastor and worked heavily in Christian education, working with the youth, especially anybody from birth to teenage was sort of where I was spending most of my time. So I've always had a passion for working with children, and that's just coming about in a different way now. And as I worked and trained more about how to work with children, different programs, one of the areas that came up was comprehensive sex education in the church. And I started learning about child abuse statistics and how important the work is of keeping children safe and being trained in boundary awareness training for clergy, things that help prevent child abuse, different seminars and that. And so I really got my eyes opened in my early 20s about how pervasive child abuse is and how important it is to have healthy relationships in all ways, shapes, or forms, especially sexual relationships. Then I had a really bad relationship in my early 20s and learned firsthand how unprepared I was for the world of dating, of intimacy, of sex, even though I had all kinds of education through my school years. So, and then I became a parent a few years later, and everything sort of converged that I wanted to give my daughter and every child I worked with a better start than I had, and especially trying to prevent child abuse as much as possible. One of the things I picked up somewhere along the way was the more children are prepared to have healthy relationships and know what's unhealthy, the less prone to abuse they can be. And so that's part of my work as a pastor, as a mom, and soon, hopefully, fingers crossed, as an educator.
Wow. That's a great testimony because I share that same kind. I think one of the big challenges in our culture is to make sure that people have that foundation of what healthy relationships are. And I think that would go such a long, long way in changing things in terms of abusive relationships on all levels.
Absolutely. As a clergy person, I work with mostly adults, and I hear many stories about the abuse they suffered as children. And so now working with early elementary age students, I wonder what can I do to help break those cycles earlier? And are there ways that the two vocations can intersect and help create healthier spaces in our community and healthier spaces for people?
Since we're also talking about clergy and and faith in general, I would like to stay a little bit in that topic, and because we know that there's a generalization, in it's almost like generally speaking, because there's the perception,
Yep.
perception the perception um, that pastor and sex education or comprehensive sexual health resources, especially for teens, are terms that do not fit well together. And you are saying that you found a point between all the intersections where they meet. Would you say that that generalization holds truth in today's age?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, it is a stereotypical generalization that you can't talk about sex at church. You really can't talk to your teens about it. If you're a pastor and people act like themselves around you, they might curse or they might say something off color. They instantly apologize. It's like you wear the clergy veneer, and it's like you can't say certain things to a clergy person, and because they don't know it or aren't supposed to know it, or I'm not sure exactly
Not supposed to
what it
hear
is.
it.
No. But it feels like there's some things that are just off top, aren't allowed to be on topic at church. So yeah, the generalization, unfortunately, I think is true.
Yeah. And before we say too much, of course, something that we have said a couple of times, and a phrase that we always use is comprehensive sex education, and we try to use it as much as we can, just almost to make a point. Uh, Especially when people think about sex education, they always think about something very narrow, and we always say no, no, no. When we talk about comprehensive, is broader. So, but it bears repeating because a lot of people don't know what comprehensive sex ed means. So, we have a definition from the God Godmature.
Guttmacher.
Yes, what Nadine said, institute. And it says that comprehensive sex ed is a right-based approach to comprehensive sexuality education, seeks to equip young people with the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values they need to determine and enjoy their sexuality physically and emotionally, individually, and in relationships. Comprehensive sex ed sees sexuality as holistic part of everything that makes people. And faith is part of it. So how does that match up with your perspective of what sex ed is, Becky?
That matches up beautifully. Encompasses everything I think sex ed should be. Absolutely. Um, go ahead.
So if that matches up with your perspective, and certainly as Jonathan said and as you said, you see a place where pastor and healthy relationships and things around sex ed kind of intersect. But at the same time, there's truth in the generalization that there's this concept in our culture that um, sex ed and church sex ed and like do not go together. Do you, as a pastor, somebody with the background and training and experience that you've had, what are your thoughts about why there is so much hesitation in faith-based environments to open the space for conversations about human sexuality and sexual health in a more comprehensive way?
I think there's a lot. Part of it's a fear in the church of talking about sex or sexuality, that it's evil, that it's bad, that it's sinful. I think we've had probably a few hundred years of difficult theology around sexuality, that it is something that is not of God, that it has been labeled as sinful, whether it connects back to Genesis 3 and the story of the fall of creation and Adam and Eve and the snake and the apple and all that, probably plays into it a bit. But we're uncomfortable in the church talking about sexuality and sex. And the truth is, we believe that every bit of us was made by God. So that includes our totality of our being. When we were talking about the definition of comprehensive sex education, the word that stuck out to me was holistic. And I think we need a more holistic view of what it means to be human in the church, and what does it mean to have bodies. And our bodies are not separate from God, but they are gifts of God, we believe. And God created every bit of them. It's not like God said, okay, sexuality, I had nothing to do with that. It just happened to come along with the package. I believe God designed us exactly the way God wanted to, and that includes our sexuality. And the other word that stood out for me in the definition of comprehensive sex education was enjoy. And I think God wants us to enjoy and to find pleasure in all sorts of things, including our bodies and sexual relationships in healthy, respectful ways.
And it's, I mean, I said it and I didn't thought about this, but it jumped into my mind. Sometimes I think when we speak about, enjoyment of sexuality, a lot of times people tend to jump into extremes, and it's just like, oh, we're gonna do whatever. We're what and what Reverend Hoover just said is just in healthy ways. It's just because a person enjoys their sexuality, enjoys their body, doesn't mean that they are gonna do, they're gonna go to the extremes. And that's something that I think always is missing from that. Sometimes of conversations or I don't know, spaces. It's healthy ways. And sometimes what is healthy for one person might not, or what a person thinks is healthy, not necessarily another person will think that is healthy for them. But as long as it's consensual, that no one is getting hurt, especially if they are adults, um, it's I don't understand why people always go into the extremes when talking about something as not as simple, because sexuality is complicated. It's complex,
It's
but as
complex.
yeah, but it's beautiful. And I think there's certain things also with faith. um you know and I go back to what you mentioned, Rebecca, about when a person is talking in front of a pastor, they don't dare to be themselves. It's like, I'm so sorry that I said this. It's just you're talking to another human being.
Right.
So I think it's important to remember that extremes are not healthy necessarily.
Right.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah. And another word that jumped out at me while I was listening to you, Rebecca, I know Becky, it says Becky. I've always called you Rebecca. I have a hard time with the Becky. I'm going to work on
It's
that.
fine.
But respectful,
Yeah.
so the positive, the pleasure, the healthy, the respectful. And I think, Johnathan, the extremes that you were talking about, a lot of times people think of those extremes. In my mind, when I think extremes, that doesn't match up very well with respectful usually in the way that where my mind goes when I think of extremes. So I think that respectful piece is really, really important.
That's are both such wise observations. It seems like when we do jump into the conversation of sex and sexuality in the church, it does go to an extreme, and we forget how to be respectful to our different places where we are in the conversation.
Mm.
In whether faith communities are talking about sexuality and healthy relationships or not, they do teach about sexuality and relationships, and sometimes that's not actually coming on front and talking about it, but actually um, being silent about it. And silent sends a powerful message just as well as actions and behaviors. So have you seen the impact of silence play out in faith communities, and if you have, so how has it come to play, or how it has expressed itself?
Absolutely. Every 3 years in the United Church of Christ, we clergy need to have boundary awareness training. And it started as a response about all the clergy sex abuse that was coming out from the Roman Catholic Church, from the United Church of Christ. I mean, every tradition has it. Every congregation I have served has had a clergy person in the past engage in some form of sexual misconduct. And that can hurt congregations for decades, especially if it's never resolved. So if the clergy person has an improper relationship, whether it's consensual or not, with an adult or not, and nobody ever helps the congregation as a whole deal with it, that trauma continues on. And often you will see such congregations go through a multitude of pastors pretty quickly. There'll be a spirit that you can feel in there of hurt, of anger. So in those ways, yes, I have seen how the silence hurts the church. And then, of course, the fact that there is clergy sex abuse going on. We can see the effects in larger traditions. The United Church of Christ is fairly small in the United States. The Roman Catholic Church, the Southern Baptist churches are much bigger. They've been in the news a lot more with the issues that they've been facing and dealing with, and trying to figure out, well, how do we move forward in healthy ways? So there is a lot of abuse that can hurt not only the people directly involved in the relationship, but the system as a whole. And then there's the shame, and how do you reconcile that? Um, the shame of either the abuse itself that people feel as victims, or the shame that they were part of a system that allowed for this to happen. And then just the shame that we pick up naturally, unfortunately, by the poor ways that we talk about sexuality in our society as a whole, inside the church and outside of the church.
So there are layers that kind of complexify the whole situation. And
Absolutely.
there's definitely an area. I mean, I get that because we don't talk about sexuality very well in our culture as a whole. Like, even talking about it is difficult. And then when there are harms that have been done, and there's the shame and the stigma and all that you just referenced wrapped into it, it makes it even harder to talk about it, or more challenging. But it also makes it more critical that we give it air, because otherwise it just festers. And it's not healthy for any of us, whether we're directly involved in that system or whether we're just part of the community. There's the impact reverberates.
Absolutely. And you peel back one layer and you find another layer. And then, because it's more comfortable to live in dysfunction that we know,
Hmm.
it's harder to deal with it and do the work of healing, because it's painful to uncover all those layers and to have to inhabit a different reality than the brokenness we've gotten used to. So then when you're trying in a church system to work with some of the pain and the trauma of a sexual abuse situation, you often get more pain and trauma from uncovering it until you can get to the point of healing.
Wow.
It's
Some
tough.
of the layers that you mentioned was shame. So we've always, since the beginning, since like a year that we started this, we have said that a way to reduce the stigma, the shame, the taboo around sexual health is normalizing conversation. So what role do you see for churches or other faith-based groups when it comes to supporting, for example, parents or other trusted adults normalizing sexual health conversations, if there's a way, at least.
I think it's complex again. I mean, all of this is complex. For a faith based organization, I think we need to do some theological work around what it means to be embodied, to have a body, that our bodies are designed by God exactly as God wanted, which means all aspects of our nature, including our sexual nature, was designed by God too. So realizing that, having conversations about that and people's understandings, I think is critical. Laying that foundation to be able to have more deeper and richer conversations that are more normalizing. One of the gifts, if there can be a gift from the pandemic, is I think we're learning how to do this, how to have conversations, checking in with each other about comfort levels with embodied things in different ways.
Mm.
So when I have a mask on, I like to check if I'm in it with somebody new, somebody different, like, do you want me to wear a mask? Do you not want me to wear a mask? We have to check in about our vaccination status, our risks. And before there were vaccines, I know I had to check in with people at church going, okay, this is what my exposure level has been, my comfort level. Tell me what yours is. Do you think we're safe to be in this space together? Should we put more distance? Should we do this virtually as opposed to in person? I think it's the same kind of conversations that we have when it comes to healthy relationships and consent and sex and sexuality. We're just having them in maybe slightly less threatening ways when we talk about viruses and vaccines. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I like that. That's a really good point, and I haven't thought about that in a bit. I know we've talked about that in the past in terms of like masks and how the analogy between like wearing masks and wearing condoms and things like that, and having conversations along those lines. But I hadn't thought of it in quite a while, nor necessarily as well as you articulated it right now. Yeah, that's good.
It's
So,
just checking in with each other.
yeah, yeah. And that's like one of the foundations of everything that we talk about with sexual health is the boundaries and the consent pieces. And when kids are, I think, for all the trauma that people talk about around the pandemic and children and young people, there is also that piece of, at least for many, these conversations that really do involve consent and boundaries and talking to people at younger and younger ages about those concepts. And that, in the mix of all this mess, is a real blessing of sorts if we can use that and build upon that.
Absolutely. I think the build upon is such a critical piece. So if we're starting to say, okay, we're already having these conversations about boundaries and consent in this way, what would it take then to move those conversations into the area of sex and sexuality? And how can we take what we already know and just apply it differently? So in terms of churches helping parents, we could point out that we're already having these conversations and create spaces for more conversations about sex and sexuality to flourish and to talk about our relationships and our bodies and how complicated it all is, trying to figure out how to be human and how to be honest with each other and be in spaces of mutuality and trust.
Yeah. I don't want to, at the risk of going down sort of more of a theological path, which is not where I was going, or not where I thought I was going, but I just can't. It always strikes me as I have to ponder this. I know certainly everybody that's listening might not be Christian, but for folks who are Christian, it sort of dumbfounds me that an embodied faith, a faith that is so much connected to embodiment in the sense of Jesus, is also a faith that is so uncomfortable, it seems, generally speaking, with anything that has to do with the body.
It's one of the big paradoxes of the Christian faith is exactly what you named. And then for people who aren't Christian, I mean, every faith tradition has something about our bodies and how it relates to the divine, and it's doing that work within whatever framework that you believe.
Honestly, I hadn't thought about it. It's just like Jung, but now that you're mentioning it, I'm like, oh. So I'm gonna take 5 minutes until I was like, oh
Okay.
my god.
While you take those 5 minutes, I really want to ask Rebecca, since you've thought about this and worked with sexuality and young people and church setting and all that kind of thing, are you aware of resources that are available with a faith-based thread that also support the idea of a comprehensive approach to sexual health education?
Yes, I know of two outstanding ones. It's tricky if you're looking for Christian-based resources that mesh with comprehensive sex education, because so much Christian stuff comes from an abstinence-based place, which I believe does not do a good service to our young people. So looking for a program that is not abstinence-based, I know of two. One of them is Our Whole Lives, that was jointly developed by the Unitarian Universalists and the United Church of Christ. It is a program that trained educators can offer through the community, faith communities. It goes from, oh gosh, Nadine, I know you have some experience in this. It starts
I think
elementary.
I think they actually have materials that go as early as kindergarten.
Okay, I'm trained on
They do,
fourth
because
or sixth
I
grade.
use those resources.
Oh, good, good.
So they do go from pretty much all grades or levels.
And they go all the way into adulthood at this point, I believe.
They do.
Yeah.
They absolutely do. And I think they have it up to like older adults, like septa-octogenarian, nonagenarian, however long people live.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful program. It's difficult to get the training on how to teach it, which means it's difficult then to offer it in the community. My dream would be to have people trained in our area to be able to offer that more frequently for all levels, from the oldest people we have down to the youngest it goes.
Yeah.
The other program I know of is called Just Say No, KNOW. And I was trained on that as part of a group of churches in Hagerstown, Maryland, where I served first, that were looking at the teen birth rate in Hagerstown, which was really high for Maryland at that time. And this was, 15, 16 years ago. And they wanted to do something to reduce the teen birth rate in Washington County, Maryland. So part of that was reaching out to the faith communities and trying to find a comprehensive sex education program that multiple denominations and traditions could sign on to. And Just Say No was very flexible in that. It was not abstinence-based, but it could be tailored to people who have more progressive beliefs, more conservative beliefs. Each faith community could do their own theological work around sex education. And we were able to reduce the teen birth rate in Washington County in the few years that I was there and working with that program.
That sounds amazing. And I like the idea of, with either of those programs, if there was a way that churches could come together, because that would definitely could broaden your base of trained people to be able to provide those programs. And then, of course, in my mind, like each individual church or faith tradition could certainly add their own, if there's something of their own that they would want to add to something like that, that could be done.
Absolutely. And modify it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we've been, I mean, it's the topic we've been talking about, faith and how your experience as a pastor has shaped your perspective and the things that you've seen. But now, talking to you as an educator, in taking into consideration that in Pennsylvania the academic standards around sexual health are virtually non-existent. We actually would talk about it in an episode, but I don't quite recall which exact episode was it. But we talk about it. As a parent, and now as a teacher in training, you also have experience with the education system. How well do you think our education system is addressing sexual health, and where do you see room for improvement?
I see lots of room for improvement. I
Exciting.
don't I don't think it's doing a very good job at all based on my experience as a parent. So I think about my upbringing, and I know we had sex education in fifth, sixth, eighth, and ninth grades. And while it was all biologically based, this is in Maryland, I grew up in Maryland, we never talked about any of the emotional aspect. I'm going to come back to that part. So then I'm watching my daughter, and she's in ninth grade now, and just getting sex education for the first time. And I'm wondering, why hasn't she had it before?
Mhm.
And if I haven't been talking with her about sex and sex ed since she was 8, where would she have learned stuff? I mean, she's almost 15. These kids are going to learn about sex and sex education somewhere. And I'd rather it be from me, from my church, from a place I know where it's coming from, and the values are what I want them to be, because it is such an important topic. One thing the schools are doing really well, and I'm seeing this more as a future educator, is socio-emotional learning. So
Mhm.
even starting in kindergarten where I am, we're talking about hands, like using nice hands and not pushing people or touching people, and being mindful of the different ways people interpret touch, and being able to name our feelings and talk about our feelings. And I'm actually learning more about my own socio-emotional well-being from learning how to teach it than I ever did in school. So on the socio-emotional front, I think schools are doing a much better job, and I'm really excited to do more with socio-emotional learning as an educator. On the sexuality front, schools are not doing a great job.
I'm really glad to hear you say that, though, because that social emotional learning is also foundational to, just like we were talking about consent and boundaries and the kind of things that you were talking about nice hands and things like that. If we can build that at younger ages, it potentially prepares the system to mature as the children mature and get into deeper topics as they get older. And that becomes part of the comprehensive sex ed, because it's about relationships and healthy relationships as much as it is about sexual behaviors specifically, which I think that's the biggest limiting thing in our culture, is that when people think sex ed, they think sexual behavior, and they forget about all this other stuff that contributes to what that sexual behavior is going to look like in terms of respectful and healthy relationships.
Absolutely.
In to finish, as a parent, as a pastor, as an educator, is there something you would like to say to our viewers before we end this evening conversation?
Hmm. Another really good question. I think it's what we've been talking about a lot. It comes down to healthy relationships. And so learning how to have a healthy relationship, be more healthy in our relationships, is so critical. And how to talk openly and honestly and faithfully with our kids about difficult topics, including sex and sexuality, um, because the cost of not talking about them is too high.
Mm.
Recently, I was reading an article that the book that I used with my daughter to talk with her about our bodies and sex when she turned 8 was on the banned book list for a public library in Missouri just this year. And it kind of scares me the direction we are heading if we can't have these critical conversations with well put together resources about how to talk about all the foundational things and the biological parts of sexuality as well. So just encourage more conversation, more openness. And if a parent doesn't know where to go to have these conversations, to keep asking around and find people who can help them and resource them and equip them and say, yes, it's really hard and it stinks, but you're doing a great job at having this conversation. And
Yes.
thank you for talking with your
Yes.
kids about it.
And that's the thing too. I really appreciate that, because you don't have to be perfect at what you're doing. You get to be human in the process and say, oops, and let's start again. And can you help me with this? And all those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
So if someone would like to get more information about the One United Church of Christ, where can they get that information?
We're on the web at oneucc.org, and we're also on Facebook. We have a Facebook page, and we're on YouTube. And you can access Facebook and YouTube through our website, and or just search the platforms, and you should find us. Our services are streamed onto YouTube, so if you want to see more about how we worship, that's a great place to check us out. And they're a great group of people. I really enjoy being their pastor.
And
And if you're looking for a clergy person who's comfortable talking about comprehensive sex ed and healthy relationships, if you don't know anyone, you know one now.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, for taking the time to be here and to talk about this important topic that I feel we should be talking more because it's part of life. No matter it really don't matter the faith of the person, the religion of the person. It's part of either from us of our daily life or of our upbringing. So it's really important to touch base on those topics that maybe we don't think go together, because we can definitely find certain intersections that will, will get points. Will give us talking points.
There you go.
In dinner conversations like the one happening this week.
That'd be
That's
an
right.
amazing Thanksgiving table. Talking about faith and
Yes.
sex at the same Thanksgiving table.
Yes,
Hey.
I love
be
it.
there.
Hey,
I
I
love
already
it.
have a list of things that I would like to talk. So we'll see what happens in that table.
Good luck.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And see you all next week. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.